Leslie Thomas had long built for herself a shell of coldness so thick it was almost numbness, as if every emotion was secondary to power and control. At Fairmont Crest, people were used to seeing a Leslie whose gaze was razor-sharp, whose words were brief and hard, and who only approached others when it served her purpose. She needed no one's comfort, no one's protection, and she believed no one was clean enough to stand beside her without becoming a burden. Yet just as the entire compound was strung tight as a wire with the final preparations for Winterfest, Leslie suddenly found herself cornered in a dark place where all the layers of armor she had built around herself began to crack. And ironically, the only person she was forced to think of, the one she had never been able to stand, was Nicole. Peaches lay on the hospital bed hovering between life and death, and the smell of disinfectant in the hospital where Nicole worked seemed to flood every thought in Leslie's mind. Peaches' illness was not just a purely medical problem. It was like a sudden tear in the velvet curtain Leslie had always used to hide her own bad choices. Peaches was not just a patient. She was a witness, someone who had stood beside Leslie in tense meetings, in those moments when Leslie recklessly adjusted budgets, slashed insurance funds, and rescheduled medical appointments just to funnel resources into the Winterfest project. If Peaches hadn't collapsed at exactly this moment, perhaps Leslie could still have convinced herself that everything was under control. But the truth was, Peaches had fallen seriously ill at the exact time Leslie could not afford anything to slip off the rails. That forced her to ask herself, was this a coincidence, or the direct consequence of the selfish decisions she had deliberately ignored? To outsiders, Winterfest was just a glittering event, a chance for Fairmont Crest to flaunt its wealth and glamour. But to Leslie, Winterfest was a life-or-death gamble. It was her chance to cement her status, to erase the stains of the past, to prove to Anita, to Vernon, to the entire Fairmont community that she was not just an annoying shadow circling the Dupree household, but someone who could single-handedly carry an entire festival, manage sponsors, control the media, and manipulate public opinion. When she fought to take charge of Winterfest, it wasn't only about career ambition. It was also a way to put Nicole in her place, a woman who once stood in the admired position, who once had a marriage, a job, a reputation, all the things Leslie had partly helped destroy. The cold face Leslie wore every day hid an ugly truth. She had used Peaches as a pawn in her power game. Peaches had a history of frail health, but Leslie brushed aside every suggestion that she rest, constantly persuading, or more accurately, pressuring her to work overtime to handle backstage coordination and manage the books at the same time. In return, she promised Peaches the chance to rise above the strata of people looked down on at Fairmont Crest, to be respected, to be named in important meetings. But when the signs of illness began to show, Leslie chose to close her eyes to them, citing the packed Winterfest schedule, wavering sponsors, a wheezing budget, and the idea that if they lost even one step, everything would collapse. That stubbornness, that blind ambition, was now looping back to strangle her. Peaches was admitted to the hospital in critical condition without full medical insurance, because part of the budget had been redirected by Leslie into unrecorded Winterfest expenses. She had quietly signed papers Peaches hadn't had time to read carefully, legitimizing delays in coverage in exchange for vague promises about later. Now, every time Leslie saw the test results and medical files in Nicole's hands, she realized they were not just documents. They were potential evidence, traces of decisions that, if exposed, would bury her at the center of a medical, legal, and financial scandal. She needed Peaches to live, not only because of the scraps of humanity left in her, but because as long as Peaches was alive, her secrets had not yet been carved open for all of Fairmont Crest to see. Nicole, meanwhile, stepped into the story from a completely different place. She had once been a woman with a solid marriage, a respectable job, and a well-regarded reputation. All of that had been eroded bit by Leslie, who twisted facts, magnified small mistakes into storms of internal and public criticism. The hints Leslie spread in those days, the relationships she subtly manipulated, had helped push Nicole out of her marriage and out of her place in Fairmont's power structure. Nicole had been forced to rebuild her life from the rubble, choosing the hospital as the only place. Still objective enough to let her work, distancing herself from personal drama to focus on her role as a professional. And now Leslie was about to drag her back into that swamp. When the news about Peaches came in, Nicole didn't just see a patient fighting for her life. She also saw a string of irregularities. Chaotic insurance files, payments delayed for no good reason, treatment plans being tampered with by budget adjustments that had no business appearing in a medical record. All of this made Nicole suspect that Peach's sudden downturn was no coincidence, especially not right before Winterfest. Behind it, there were clearly wrongful decisions, forced sacrifices that someone, most likely Leslie, had deliberately kept in the dark. The anger in Nicole did not erupt loudly. It smoldered like hot coals. She could not forget how Leslie had once pushed her to the edge, but her instinct as a medical professional would not allow her to turn her back on a life. However, unlike before, Nicole now understood the power games at Fairmont Crest all too well. She knew that if she agreed to get involved without carefully thinking it through, she could easily become the convenient target for blame. Just one small mistake in treatment, just one decision taken out of context in the files, and Nicole would be the first name dragged in front of the public. She knew Leslie well enough to understand that this woman would never put herself in the eye of the storm if she still had any other choice. The fact that Leslie came to her, not to Anita or Vernon, was not because Nicole was the closest person to her, but because Nicole was important enough and reputable enough to save the situation, while being isolated enough to easily become a sacrificial offering if everything blew up. Leslie knew exactly what she was doing when she reached out for help. In the moments alone in the hospital hallway, she was not only afraid for Peach's life, she was also calculating every next step. She thought of Anita, who, despite her outward kindness, had never fully trusted Leslie after so many power struggles. She thought of Vernon, who was holding secrets of his own and might get pulled into the mess if she involved him. She thought of the Winterfest sponsors, of the fragile contracts that could shatter with just one news blurb about a medical scandal. On the list of people she could turn to, every name was crossed out by political or financial risks, or simply because they no longer trusted her. Only Nicole remained. Someone with enough professional competence, enough credibility in the hospital, but with no powerful backing beyond her work itself. The real question was not what Leslie wanted Nicole to help with, but whom she wanted Nicole to help first. Save Peaches at all costs, even if it meant putting the hospital and Nicole herself at legal risk if the truth about the insurance records came out. Or save Leslie by using Nicole's expertise and reputation to conceal, adjust, even reinterpret certain sensitive details in the files so that everything would look like an unpredictable medical case with no clear fault. Deep down, Leslie herself might not even know where the line lay between remorse and survival instinct. She only knew that if she couldn't pull Nicole into this, she would have to face the storm alone. And she was far too used to turning the people she needed into pieces on her board, not into allies. On Nicole's side, the painful memories of the past resurfaced sharply. She remembered those meetings where Leslie stood on the opposite side, using half-truths and insinuations to cast doubt on her competence. She remembered the moment her marriage fractured under the weight of rumors, under evidence twisted by Leslie, whether by accident or design, and dropped into the right ears. She had lost almost everything that mattered, and although not all of it was solely Leslie's fault, Nicole knew that this cold woman had made her fall faster and harder. Now, facing this new plea, Nicole stood between two poles. On one side were ethics and the professional oath that forced her to place the patient's life above all else. On the other were memories of betrayal, of being used and abandoned, of the fear of becoming a shield for someone else's sins. Nicole understood that she could impose conditions, even if Leslie didn't say it aloud. The situation itself had handed her bargaining power. She could agree to intervene, but it would no longer be the unconditional help of the past. If she was forced to step into the gray area of this story, the area that might involve adjusting records, deciding which information to highlight and which to blur, she would not let herself become a victim again. Invisible lines began to form in her mind. If she had to save Peaches, then Leslie had to face the truth. If she had to stand up to protect the hospital's reputation, then Leslie could no longer treat her as a storm shield. Her anger was no longer a wild, destructive blaze but was slowly turning into a cold drive to reset the balance between these two women who had always seen each other as a thorn in the eye. Meanwhile, Winterfest was approaching at an unstoppable pace. Leslie knew the state of the budget better than anyone. A major sponsor had quietly pulled out after receiving anonymous information about potential legal risks involving the organizing team. There were signs that someone was using her own tactics against her, leaking information, sowing doubt and fear to isolate their opponent. Leslie dimly sensed that some new force in the shadows, sponsor, a board member, or even someone within the Dupree family, was quietly pushing her to the brink. In that game, Peaches had become the most obvious weak point. If she could not control the narrative around Peaches' condition, if Nicole, with all her justified anger, decided to speak up about what she had seen, Leslie would lose everything. Winterfest would collapse, her reputation would be in ruins, and those who had once feared her would gladly tear apart the image she had painstakingly built. That is why Leslie's plea, though wrapped in the language of concern and affection, was in fact a calculated move. She needed Nicole to play two roles at once. The one who saved Peaches, and the one who, willingly or not, stitched up the holes in the net Leslie had woven too carelessly. Nicole saw this clearly, and that very clarity made her inner conflict even sharper. She was no saint who could erase all old wounds, but she was also not cruel enough to ignore a life hanging by a thread. For Nicole, the question of whether to help Leslie was no longer simple. It had become a choice about the path she would take from here. Stay outside the power games and pay the price of being labeled cold-hearted by Leslie, or step into the fight, accepting that by taking the chance to protect Peaches, she would also be reaching into a web of schemes with no easy way out. Under the harsh white hospital lights, with the beeping of Peaches' monitors ticking steadily in the background, both Leslie and Nicole felt as if they were standing on a fragile dividing line. One woman was haunted by the need to turn Winterfest into a stage for power, to the point of sacrificing others' health and even her own morality. The other had once lost everything to the others' manipulations and now held in her hands the chance to both save a life and redefine her place in the power game at Fairmont Crest. Both were angry, both carried unhealed wounds, and both understood that whatever decision they made now would not only determine Peaches' fate, but also open a new chapter in the silent war between them, a battle in which, this time, neither of them wanted to stand. In the role of the victim,